Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Preservation School class about scenic landmarks. We have several Six to Celebrate events coming up. Bayside Uncovered, a virtual tour of Queens' charming waterfront community on October 16th. The History of Architecture of Downtown Brooklyn walking tour on October 26th, and 2 panels on the Garment District on November 7th and the 14th. In addition, we have a book talk, New Building in Old Cities, Lessons for Historic Preservation and Sustainable New Development on October 8th. And we have the Landmarks Lion Gala honoring Michael Hiller on October 29th. Information about all of our upcoming programming can be found on our website, hdc.org. If you have any questions about programming, you can contact me at marbulu@hdc.org. Tonight's class will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel for free viewing. You may also watch all of our previous Preservation School classes, virtual tours, and conference panels on our YouTube channel. I would like to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, City Council, and the New York State Council on the Arts for supporting Preservation School. If you have any questions, you can add them to the chat, and we will address them at the end. Now I'll hand it over to Jeremy Woodoff to lead tonight's class. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone to Preservation School. Our subject tonight is scenic landmarks. And to start, I'll explain what a scenic landmark is, and then how they're designated and regulated by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Since there are only 12 such landmarks, I'm going to talk briefly about each one. Until 1973, there was no such thing as a scenic landmark. New York's 1965 landmarks law allowed for designation only of individual landmarks and historic districts. The 1973 amendment provides authority for designation of scenic landmarks and interior landmarks as well. But as we'll see later, parks have been designated as part of historic districts since the very beginning. So what is a scenic landmark? Section 25-302 of the Administrative Code defines it as any landscape feature or aggregate of landscape features, any part of which is 30 years old or older, which has or have a special character or special historic or aesthetic interest or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation, and which has been designated a scenic landmark pursuant to the provisions of this chapter. And to designate a scenic landmark, Section 25-303 states that the Commission shall have power after a public hearing to designate and to make supplemental designations as additions to a list of scenic landmarks located on property owned by the city, which are identified by a description setting forth the general characteristics and location thereof. In other words, a scenic landmark is any city-owned site, any part of which is 30 years old or older, that has landscape features, and that the Commission decides to designate following a public hearing. This slide shows the 12 scenic landmarks in order of their designation. That's an average of one every 4 years over the 50 years the category has been available. My first thought when I think about scenic landmarks is the great works of Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. But as you can see, only 7 of the 12 scenic landmarks are by this firm or its successors. And of the first 4 scenic landmark designations, only 1 is by Olmsted and Vaux. That one, of course, is Central Park, the first scenic landmark and the first great collaboration of Olmsted and Vaux. This is a bit of the story of the winning design in the competition for the new park. The well-connected English-born architect Calvert Vaux and the Connecticut-born writer, surveyor, clerk, and farmer Frederick Law Olmsted were casual acquaintances, but shared a belief that nature had the power to uplift and refine the human spirit. Vaux suggested they collaborate on a design. The new partners worked nights and weekends through the fall and winter of 1857 to 58. Vaux's son Downing remembered that the drawings needed, quote, a great deal of grass to be put in by the usual small dots and dashes. And it became the friendly thing for callers to help in the work by joining in and adding some grass to Central Park. Preparations continued to the last possible moment. Arriving at the Arsenal building, which was in the site that was to become Central Park. Late in the evening of March 31st, 1858, Olmsted and Vaux had to wake a caretaker to deliver their proposal, only minutes before the deadline for entries. Logged in under the name Greensward as entry number 33 of 33 received, it was brilliant in presentation and bold in design. Their large-scale master plan was executed on high-quality paper mounted on linen, which is shown here. There are two texts, the description of a plan for the improvement of the Central Park Greensward and particulars of construction and estimate were professionally printed by William Cullen Bryant and Company, and their 12 presentation boards featured a mix of graphite drawings, album imprints, and oil sketches related to particular views. All that from the New York Municipal Archives. This is an example of one of the photographs thought to have been taken by Matthew Brady of one of the sites in the park and the oil sketch of what Olmsted and Vaux proposed for that site. It seems to me that in 1858, seeing a presentation like this, complete with photographs, which were a fairly new thing then, for a kind of park that had never been built anywhere, certainly not in the United States, must have been quite an experience for the judges. I'll spend a bit of time talking about the design principles of Central Park, as they are present in most of their other park designs as well. First, the park is naturalistic in design, a simulation and in some cases an exaggeration of nature. This, they felt, was the best approach for a park that was to be free and open to all classes and to which most users could turn as their only antidote to a crowded city in an increasingly urbanized nation. Separation of traffic was one of the park's great innovations. Bridle paths, pedestrian paths, and carriage drives were all separate, as were the sunken transverse roads. This design feature led to the creation of more than 24 masonry and iron bridges and arches, plus the transverse road bridges and small rustic bridges throughout the park. These and other picturesque and rustic park structures were largely the responsibility of Jacob Ray Mould. Mould's colorful, high Victorian style, used for everything from buildings to drinking fountains to signs, added a layer of delight to the park user's experience and was harmonious with the colors, forms, and complexity of the naturalistic landscape. Even early on, those in charge of the park misunderstood its purpose and design. Olmsted had to fight to maintain the park's design integrity. In my view, the most important words ever written by Olmsted and Vaux concerning their park work are these, quote, "The only solid ground of resistance to dangers of this class will be found to rest in the conviction that the park throughout is a single work of art, and as such, subject to the primary law of every work of art, namely, that it shall be framed upon a single noble motive, to which the design of all its parts, in some more or less subtle way, shall be confluent and helpful." I love the sense of time travel that comes from seeing location shots of New York in old movies. Central Park has been used frequently as a movie location. A recent discovery of mine is the 1948 Portrait of Jenny, starring Joseph Cotten and Jennifer Jones. Several scenes are filmed at the Dairy Loggia, which was demolished a short time later. The loggia was rebuilt by the Central Park Conservancy in 1981 as one of its early projects. I should mention that what I'm saying about these parks is naturally very brief. I could probably spend an hour on each one. There are many sources if you're interested to find out more. Wikipedia has some excellent articles. Some of the Landmarks Commission's designation reports are excellent. And even the Parks Department has some good information on its website. Olmsted and Vaux planned a main park entrance at 59th Street and 5th Avenue, but the design evolved far from what had been a simple notch in the park for a carriage waiting and entry point. In a preview of the City Beautiful movement to come at the turn of the century, Richard Morris Hunt designed a grandiose scheme in 1863, which was opposed by Olmsted and Vaux, and fortunately not built. Sherman's monument was installed in 1903. Later, Carl Bitter proposed a City Beautiful style fountain, balustrade, and columns. This design was expanded upon in 1913 by Carrere and Hastings to include both halves of the plaza. The balustrades and two of the monumental columns were built, but are now lost. You can see, if you follow my cursor, one of the columns is here. This is Carl Bitter's fountain. And on the other side of the fountain is the other column. Here we're looking north towards the park. Pulitzer Fountain, designed by Carl Bitter, remains on the south half of the plaza, and Augustus St. Gaudens's Sherman statue on the north half. LPC's designation report for the plaza states, the commission further finds that among its important qualities, Grand Army Plaza was laid out in accordance with a carefully prepared plan that is an excellent example of the influence of the City Beautiful movement, that it contains two of the finest works by the notable American sculptors Augustus St. Gaudens and Carl Bitter, and that it is a sophisticated and urbane addition to the character of Fifth Avenue, that it is a tastefully restrained entrance to Central Park, and that it creates a graceful and civilized ambiance for the people of New York. The site of Bryant Park had long been in public use, but its first formal designation as a park, called Reservoir Square, came in 1846 in association with the New Croton Distributing Reservoir. In 1853, the New York Crystal Palace was built on the site as a venue for an international exhibition of the industry of all nations, an imitation of, or perhaps homage to, the 1851 Crystal Palace and Great Exhibition in London. You can see the reservoir with its battered Egyptian Revival style walls over here in the distance, facing Fifth Avenue. This view of the Crystal Palace is taken from Sixth Avenue. The New York Crystal Palace burned to the ground in 1858. During the Civil War, the site was used for drilling and tenting Union troops. On May 12, 1884, the name of the site was officially changed from Reservoir Square to Bryant Park in honor of William Cullen Bryant, the poet, editor, and orator, and a supporter of the creation of Central Park. In the early 1930s, the deteriorated park was redesigned by architect Lusby Simpson in a completely different style, who had been an associate in the firm of George B. Post and Sons. It was quickly reconstructed under the auspices of new Parks Commissioner Robert Moses. It again deteriorated in the 1960s, and by 1973, the Parks Commissioner threatened to close it to the public because it was so dangerous. When I arrived in New York in 1980, I would not enter the park, and I didn't like walking alongside it. Those of you who didn't live through this era in the city probably can't comprehend the level of danger and fear this park engendered. Despite this, LPC fearlessly designated the park as a scenic landmark in 1974. It wanted to have a say in its future. With the formation of the Bryant Park Restoration Corporation in 1980, there was an infusion of funds and programming and eventual restoration in 1988 to 92 by Hannah Olin and Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer. The Landmarks Commission was closely involved in the redesign process. The most serious internal dispute that I'm aware of that ever happened at LPC, one which became very public, concerned the proposed restaurant at the back of the library. You can see that here. Technically, this was not in the park, but on the library site. The dispute involved two of the most able commissioners LPC has ever had, Chair Gene Norman and Tony Tung. The original proposal was for a much larger building that extended across the full width of the library. The Panic and Needle Park was released in 1971. Verdi Square was nicknamed Needle Park because apparently the landscape consisted mostly of used hypodermic needles. One might ask why LPC thought that this little triangle, which had nothing of note in it except the 1906 statue of Giuseppe Verdi by Pasquale Civiletti, should be a scenic landmark. The designation report provides an answer. The large neo-Florentine Central Savings Bank, now Apple Bank, which you can see here on the right side of the picture, on the north side of 73rd Street between Broadway and Amsterdam Avenue, provides a visually dramatic backdrop for the square and for the statue. The open space of Verdi Square allows the full play of light on the rusticated facade of this bank, so that the controlled movement of light and dark on the surface of the bank, created by the deep rustication and recessed bay, contrasts well with the soft moving shadows of the square. Together, the square and the bank produce a quiet ambiance. In other words, LPC took a broad view of its role as a protector of the historic urban environment, beyond a focus on discrete sites. Once again, it was determined to be a player in the future of a historic park. This shows that Verdi Square is actually part of a much larger intersection known as Sherman Square, which extends south to 70th Street. But you can see Verdi Square here in the upper center part of the picture. This is before the Apple Bank was built. A Wikipedia article tells the story of many cycles of renovation and deterioration of the square. I had thought these cycles had finally ended in the early 2000s with the closing of the northbound lanes of Broadway for construction of the new 72nd Street station entrance, which you see here, and expansion and restoration of the park. But alas, by 2018, Verdi Square had earned a new nickname, Vermin Square. Perpetual cycles of Parks Department cutbacks had left the park uncared for. Virginia creeper had taken over and its matted debris was a haven for rats. A new Friends of Verdi Square was formed, and this volunteer group redesigned and replanted the square and has been maintaining it ever since, despite hardships such as a lack of a water source. Incidentally, this lamppost was taken from Riverside Park at the Fireman's Memorial. I don't know what the backstory of that is. Olmsted was as much an urban and regional planner as he was a landscape architect. At the time he and Vaux were designing Prospect Park, he had a plan for a citywide parkway system, a brand new concept. Only two parts of this were built, Ocean and Eastern Parkways, connecting Prospect Park with the then eastern edge of Brooklyn and with Coney Island. The broad center drive was unpaved for pleasure riding and driving. The side service roads were paved with granite blocks as they serviced the buildings that would line the parkways. One of the malls was turned into a bikeway early on and remains so today. Today's vehicular traffic has vastly altered the experience of traversing these parkways. When Ocean Parkway received a major reconstruction around 1980, there was no effort to use furnishings and paving materials that might help restore some of the parkway's historic character, despite its status as a recently designated scenic landmark. Olmsted and Vaux considered, and many agree, that Prospect Park was an improvement on Central Park. In part, this is because the Brooklyn Park wasn't burdened by the constraints of the New York Park. Transverse roads interrupting the landscape weren't needed, and there were no pre-existing reservoirs or a planned museum to incorporate. The result was that a much broader landscape brush could be used. The Long Meadow, which is indicated here as the green, still not named the Long Meadow, extends nearly a mile. The watercourse meanders uninterrupted through much of the park, and the broad midwood forest is large enough to get lost in. Those three types of landscapes, turf, wood, and water, are the park's building blocks, each carefully interacting with the others. There's also a more formal garden-esque area, the concert ground, which is the equivalent of Central Park's terrace. The carved embellishment is perhaps even finer than that of the terrace. It was executed by English architect Thomas Wysdell, who was Olmsted's colleague and the Jacob Ray mold equivalent in Prospect Park. The user's experience, oh, and here I should say, this was a drinking fountain that was part of that concert ground construction at the edge of the lake. When the Kate Woolman skating rink was built in 1961, this whole area was destroyed. And when the Kate Woolman rink was recently demolished itself, and that section of the park restored, the old fountain was found buried in the muck at the bottom of the lake. The user's experience of Prospect Park and similar Olmsted parks was based less on a series of destinations, but rather on visual sequences and carefully managed views as one moved through and between each of these park landscapes. The separation of traffic concept was retained, and there are masonry and iron bridges, though not nearly as many as in Central Park. More than any other park in the city, Prospect Park was graced with a series of Beaux-Arts and City Beautiful structures in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Olmsted and Vaux would not likely have approved. Olmsted was still with us early in this period, and he may have been reconciled to this change in taste. He was, after all, chief landscape architect for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, at which the City Beautiful movement was invented. These classical structures and sculptures embellish many of the park's entrances, where they have little effect on the park's naturalistic design and character. Some consider these to be some of the finest works of public sculpture in the city. Here are the Horse Tamers by McMonnies and McKimney and White. This is at the park circle entrance. Other neoclassical buildings and structures were added within the park, more problematic for their effects on the naturalistic landscape. The earlier examples of these, however, are considered important enough that they were designated as individual landmarks before the Commission had the power to designate scenic landmarks. One wonders if the Commission considered designating the shelter house, for example, or the boathouse as individual landmarks, with the landmark site being the entire park, which is, after all, on a single tax lot. The Prospect Park Handbook is a short but excellent description and explanation of the park. The author, Clay Lancaster, was curator of Prospect Park in the 1960s, one of the very earliest, the very beginnings of a renewed interest in these great Olmsted parks. He says of the classically inspired buildings and structures added to the park in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that they serve uses consistent with the original park purposes, and most important, each was very carefully designed for perfect harmony with its setting. The classic peristyle, or shelter building that we saw before, this one, the boathouse and tennis house, send people out to enjoy the natural advantages of the park and may be looked upon as centrifugal in spirit, whereas later buildings like the picnic house, zoo, bandshell, and the original skating rink from 1961 are centripetal. They suck them into their specially conditioned interiors, which are not the park at all, but extraneous attractions. And he adds that, as one might expect, the pouring of money into such illegitimate constructions as these from the 1920s up to 1960 was accompanied by a withdrawing of funds for maintenance, thus allowing deterioration of the grounds and planting gradually to spoil those portions of the park that had escaped defacement by the structures. Comparing these two skating rink structures, this one from 1961 and the other one from 2013, one would be hard-pressed to say that we've learned anything about how to design new buildings in a historic park. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say we've unlearned what we once knew. I would be remiss not to note the cameo played by the park's Vale of Cashmere as the setting for Meryl Streep and Kevin Kline's Moonlight Dance in Sophie's Choice. Eastern Parkway has the same design as Ocean Parkway. It was nearly destroyed for construction of the IRT Eastern Parkway line, but a change in the subway design allowed the parkway to remain largely intact, except for numerous ventilation grates. Unlike Ocean Parkway, when Eastern Parkway was reconstructed by the Department of Transportation in the early 1990s, a major effort was made to restore its historic character. The director of capital projects at the Parks Department at that time, Bronson Binger, was a strong preservation advocate. He declared there would be no exposed concrete anywhere on the parkway, and in fact, there is none. A special coordinated design for streetlights, traffic signals, and signs was implemented. This was before reproductions of historic New York City streetlights were available. American elm trees once lined the parkway, and disease-resistant cultivars were planted on several blocks to restore the majestic canopy only elms can provide. The Landmarks Commission was fully engaged with the Department of Transportation and Parks in the development of the design for Eastern Parkway's reconstruction. The designs for both parkways originally included regulations requiring 30-foot building setbacks from the property line and prohibiting noxious uses in buildings along the parkways. These regulations long predated zoning and still exist in the city's administrative code. Riverside Park extends from 72nd Street to about 158th Street, but the designated park extends only as far as 125th Street. Olmsted and Vaux's vision was for a meandering drive, a sharp rebuke to Manhattan's grid, and a linear park in places very narrow and very steep, descending to the flats along the river, on which ran the Hudson River and later the New York Central Railroad. In 1885, it was decided that General Ulysses S. Grant would be buried in Riverside Park. His temporary tomb was designed by Jacob Ray Mould, and it was Mould's last important work before his death in 1886. James H. Duncan's neoclassical tomb opened to the public in 1897. For a while after that, Mould's very simple yet substantial tomb could be seen in the shadow of the granite monument, unguarded and unsung. Olmsted and Vaux expressed concern that Duncan's monument was inappropriate and would lend an unfortunate and overbearing funerary air to this section of Riverside Park. Francis R. Kowski, in his recent biography of Mould, muses that for people like Olmsted, who had actively participated in the Civil War, Mould's unpretentious burial ground mausoleum and its resident must have evoked more the ghosts of a terrible past than the glory of victory that Duncan's tomb proclaimed. By the early 20th century, the railroad was an increasingly obnoxious neighbor to the mansions and apartment houses on the drive. It wanted to expand and use adjacent land for commercial purposes. This set up a clash between the railroad's plans and residents and park advocates. In 1913, the railroad proposed constructing a tunnel for its tracks. In the 1920s, McKinmead and White designed a neoclassical podium that would roof over the tracks, and here you see the beginning of construction of that podium. A new drive would run atop the podium and would connect with the West Side or Miller Highway being built to the south. In 1934, Robert Moses had the plan revised by Gilmore Clark, Michael Rapuano, and Clinton Lloyd. It put the new roadway at the water's edge, simplified the podium, and put landscape and active recreation facilities on top. The reconstruction rebuilt most of the park, leaving only the drive, the park wall, and small sections of Olmsted's original landscape intact. In the 1970s, following the partial collapse and closure of the old West Side Highway below Riverside Park, the Westway project was proposed to construct a new highway along the Hudson River. The 1980 designation of Riverside Park as a scenic landmark took place during the Westway controversy. The designation report states, quote, "Now there are changes under consideration which center on the need for a new highway to replace the disintegrated Miller Highway. Residents of the West Side fear the impact of such plans on the park and their neighborhood. On June 10, 1979, several hundred proponents of Riverside Park joined in a conference sponsored by Ruth Messenger, council member in the 4th District, and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, and co-sponsored, believe it or not, by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and a host of other park supporters. Once again, LPC fearlessly inserted itself as an advocate in the fray. The designation report's conclusion states, since the beginning of the parks movement, it has been a tenet of both theorists and designers that parks must be for all the people and not for any special interest groups. The greatest benefit of a park, it has been said, is its openness to all members of the society. If the theorists are occasionally patronizing, the effect has nevertheless been to ensure democratic usage of the parks and prevent the appropriation of portions of parkland. The designation of Riverside Park and Drive as a New York City scenic landmark will help to ensure that it remains the kind of open space its designers intended, close quote. Curiously, the designation report discusses Olmsted and Vaux's design at some length, but barely mentions the Moses-era enlargement, which almost completely rebuilt the park. The restrained neoclassicism, formality, and materials and finishes of the rebuilt park, a portion of which you can see here, became the Parks Department standard for the next 50 years and more. Fort Tryon Park was the last great park in New York City designed by the Olmsted office. By this time, 1931 to 35, the firm was known as Olmsted Brothers, with the principals being Olmsted's son and stepson. The design represents a continuation of the naturalistic and picturesque New York City public park legacy begun in Central Park. This highly prolific firm continued as Olmsted Brothers until 1961, just after the last Olmsted descendant passed away, and as Olmsted Associates until 1979. Located on some of the highest open public land in Manhattan, overlooking the Hudson River, the 66-acre Fort Tryon Park is rich with historic associations. The park and the cloisters, located at the northern end, were gifts to the city by John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Part of the property was the site of Fort Tryon Hall, seen here, a Gilded Age mansion designed by Guy Lowell. The plan was to make some public use of the house, but it burned down before the park construction began. Some of the estate's site features remain, however, and were incorporated into the park, including this spectacular arcade and overlook. Construction of this park was nearly contemporaneous with that of the Riverside expansion, but it was starkly different in character, a continuation of the English 18th century naturalistic romantic tradition that informed Central Park. The four landscape styles found within this tradition are readily apparent at Fort Tryon Park. The sublime in views of the Hudson River and Palisades, the beautiful in the small open lawns, the picturesque in its wooded slopes, and the garden-esque in the heather garden. And also, curiously enough, at the northeast corner of the park, we see the future. This very formal, symmetrical playground with a wading pool was also part of the Fort Tryon Park design, but it looks much more toward the designs that were being undertaken in Riverside Park at nearly the same time. Morningside Park was designed by Olmsted and Vaux in 1873, but construction was long delayed, and it was Jacob Ray Mould, as an employee of the Parks Department, who in 1881 detailed the initial work, including the layout of Morningside Drive and other streets around the park, and the spectacular retaining wall and stairs at the western side. This is the southern end of the park, and you can see the one area that was flat enough for a lawn. You can see it has an irregular edge and some rock outcroppings, very naturalistic design. In 1968, Columbia University was embroiled in anti-war demonstrations, which targeted the institution for complicity. At the same time as these demonstrations were taking place, Columbia was advancing its takeover of a large section of Morningside Park to build a gymnasium for the campus. This oval athletic field in the foreground is what would have become of that more natural open lawn. The gym was to have contained a convenient back door for use by the community east of the park. The gym issue was quickly incorporated into the opposition to Columbia's actions in general. The bulldozers were literally stopped. They had already gouged out a section of the park. Morningside Park was supposed to be one of the parks designated in the early 1980s as a result of the Olmsted Project, which I'll talk about shortly. At the Commission's public hearing on the designation, the long dormant rage of the 1968 demonstrations was reignited. I'm not sure anyone really understood the opposition to the designation, but the Commission was blindsided. Perhaps the memories were still too fresh, and participants in the demonstrations, many of whom still lived on the Upper West Side, didn't want anything to happen to change the status quo at Morningside Park. The designation was dropped until 25 years later. The park was quietly became a scenic landmark in 2008. In the interim, the Parks Department did what I think of is a very nice job creating a small picturesque pond, seen here, in the area where the destruction had occurred. After much public advocacy, the Coney Island Boardwalk was finally designated in 2018. But in its designation report, the Commission went out of its way to limit its own jurisdiction over changes. In the statement of regulatory intent, the Commission notes that for scenic landmarks, which are New York City-owned properties, the LPC review of proposed work is advisory to the Public Design Commission. This statement in the designation report is not correct, as the Commission's review is not advisory to the Public Design Commission, but to the agency undertaking work. In this case, it would be the Parks Department. We will discuss the question of advisory versus binding reviews later. The designation report continues, quote, in reviewing proposed work, the Commission will review significant changes in length, width, or configuration of the boardwalk, removal of portions of the boardwalk, removal or reduction of entries to the boardwalk from the north, significant alterations to existing comfort stations and shade pavilions, and designs for new permanent structures. There is nothing about materials, which seems odd for a structure whose essence is that it's made out of wood boards. Christabel Goff, in her recent report called Regulatory Capture, Watching a City Commission Lose Its Way, says that the designation report for the boardwalk, quote, notes lyrically the boardwalk's democratic spirit and the access it provides to sun, sand, surf, and sea breezes. Can these be its protected features? Apart from the novelty of landmarking a breeze, from the standpoint of tradition, which sometimes favors restoration to original conditions, landmarking the boardwalk as it is today, without adverse comment on the new substitute materials in use, which are plastic and concrete, is not a positive move. Old Croton Aqueduct Walk, the city's most recently designated scenic landmark, has been used for public recreation longer than any other scenic landmark. This use began in 1842 when the aqueduct was completed between a reservoir in Croton, New York, and the distributing reservoir on the site of what is now the New York Public Library at 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue. We saw that earlier when we looked at the Bryant Park landmark designation. It is said to have been a favorite walk of Edgar Allan Poe, whose cottage in the Bronx was nearby. This is not a photograph of Poe, but a lithograph made in 1930 of Poe supposedly walking on the High Bridge, which was part of the aqueduct connecting Manhattan and the Bronx. The High Bridge walk was not open during Poe's lifetime, but he apparently really did enjoy walking along Aqueduct Walk. The aqueduct itself is a horseshoe-shaped tunnel, 41 miles long, 8.5 feet high, and 7.5 feet wide. It's lined with brick and set on a stone foundation. The top of the structure became a popular public walkway almost from the beginning. Today, because of grading of streets as the city developed, some parts of the aqueduct are raised above street level and the public walk now runs alongside. The designated aqueduct walk is almost 5 miles long and stretches from West Kingsbridge Road to West Burnside Avenue in the Bronx. After being threatened with development and construction of a trolley line, the surface rights to the walk were transferred to the Parks Department in 1930. This was not the trolley line that threatened it. This actually came later when a street was put under the aqueduct, which is running on top. This arch built of marble no longer exists. So in 1930, when after the surface of the walk was transferred to the Parks Department, renovations were designed by Gilmore Clark and included construction of retaining walls, entrances where the path is not at grade, and recreation facilities. Today, the linear park is a mixture of original aqueduct masonry, 1930s era stone walls and stairs, and more modern recreation facilities. It's the only scenic landmark in the Bronx, and it clearly exhibits a visible, layered construction history. I have to note that there are many other parks in the city that are designated, but are not one of the 12 scenic landmarks. These include some of our most historic parks. These parks were designated as part of historic districts, and in one case, City Hall Park, as the landmark site of the individual City Hall landmark. It's interesting, but perhaps not unexpected, that so many historic districts are associated with parks, which were often key to the development of residential districts around them. When these parks fall at the edge of proposed districts, the Commission usually, but not always, included them in the designation. The three notable exceptions are Union and Madison Squares and Marcus Garvey Park in the Bronx, which remain unprotected by landmark designation. Olmsted and Vaux's Fort Greene Park is an example of one that was included within the district's boundaries. I believe the first park in the city to be protected by landmark designation is the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, which was included within the boundaries of the Brooklyn Heights Historic District, designated in 1965. City Hall Park was likely second, designated as a site of City Hall in 1966. And just a side note, this fountain, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful in the city, was installed in the park, I believe, in the 1870s, later moved to a park in the Bronx and largely dismantled. And then about 20 years ago, it was moved back to City Hall Park and restored. The design is by Jacob Ray Mold. Before getting to the final section of this talk on regulation of scenic landmarks, I want to spend a minute or two on the Landmarks Commission's Olmsted Project. When I arrived at LPC in 1980, it was in the middle of a special grant-funded effort called the Olmsted Project. Staff were hired to research the work of Olmsted and Vaux and their New York parks in particular. The project had two goals. The first was to provide materials to enable the Commission to designate more of the city's Olmsted parks. Before the project, only two of their parks, Central and Prospect, had been designated, along with the two Brooklyn parkways. The second purpose was to produce an exhibition and catalog called The Art of the Olmsted Landscape. The exhibition was mounted in the American Wing courtyard of the Metropolitan Museum in 1981 or 82. It was a big deal. While there had been some revival of interest and understanding of Olmsted and Vaux's work in the late 1960s and 1970s, the city's fiscal crisis prevented almost all work from being done in the city's parks for many years. In 1980, money was just starting to flow. The Central Park Conservancy and Prospect Park Alliance had just been created, and master plans for restoration were in progress. So the timing was fortuitous. This project gave those who would be responsible for designing and reviewing upcoming work in the Parks Department, consulting firms, Landmarks Commission, Public Design Commission, and others, a wealth of information to work with. The importance and historic basis for the design of these parks were being rediscovered, disseminated, and celebrated. I've been trying for years to obtain images of the Met's exhibition. The Met's own archive has only early handwritten notes on the proposed exhibit panels and a copy of Paul Goldberger's New York Times review. The Landmarks Commission still, I believe, has the photographs and drawings that were used to illustrate the exhibits, but no one seems to have photographs of the exhibit itself, which included banners and a large model, or of the exhibit panels. Just recently, I found online a reference to a half-hour video, or more likely at the time a film, released in 1983 and called Olmsted and Central Park, part of a series called At the Met. The VHS tapes exist in some academic libraries, but have proved impossible to get so far. There's a short trailer on YouTube that includes a half-second view of what appears to be the exhibit in the American wing. This poor screenshot from that trailer shows the centerpiece of that exhibit, a large model of Central Park, about 15 feet long, I believe. To the sides, you can see the tables which held the exhibit panels. Because the series was produced by the Met, I hope the full program includes substantial footage of the exhibit. I expect to review a copy in a couple of weeks. I wish I'd been able to get to it before this presentation tonight. This is a bit of a trip through memory lane for me, but I feel it's time for a revival of the understanding that the art of the Olmsted landscape brought to those of us involved with the great works of Olmsted and Vaux, including those whose tasks today include regulating proposed work in scenic landmarks. To give you a sense of the importance the Commission once placed on its regulatory work in scenic landmarks, I'm showing you this snapshot from a site visit to Bethesda Terrace in Central Park when the big restoration project there was being proposed. In this view, I count at least 7 sitting landmarks commissioners, including the chair, the agency's counsel, the directors of the survey and research departments, the chief of staff, the director of communications, and others, including a much younger version of me. And that brings us to the final section of this class. I'm not going to discuss specific examples of scenic landmark regulation, good or bad. That would have to be the subject of another class. What I hope to do is explain the mechanism of regulation. From the time of its establishment in 1898, the Art Commission of the City of New York, today called the Public Design Commission, or PDC, reviewed all proposed construction on or above city property. The design had to be approved by the Art Commission before the work could be undertaken. Such construction included new buildings or renovations, park construction or alteration, bridges, street furnishings, and works of art. The left-hand column of this chart describes this process. So if you can follow my cursor, a proposal would come in from a city agency to the Art Commission. They'd undertake a review. The proposal might be revised at the Art Commission's request, and then the commission eventually would issue a certificate either approving or denying the proposal. With the coming of the Landmarks Law in 1965, proposed alterations to city-owned sites that were also landmarks or within historic districts also required review by the Landmarks Commission. The section of the administrative code that refers to Landmarks Commission review of work on city-owned property is 25-318. In brief, this section requires any agency proposing to undertake work on a landmark to submit the proposal to the LPC, which is mandated to issue a report to the agency on its proposed work. Besides going to the agency making the application, the report is sent to the mayor and the city council and is published in the city record. LPC has 45 days to issue the report. The administrative code says nothing more about the process, including how LPC should interact with the Art Commission, or PDC, what the contents of the report should include, or whether the commission can or must hold a public hearing on a proposal. I don't believe the agency has ever adopted any rules further defining the process for review of city projects. It's apparent that because these are called reports and not permits, the law does not require the agency to defer to the Landmarks Commission. This is unlike the case for most regulation landmarks does, which involves private property. For private property, work cannot proceed unless the commission approves it. For as long as I was responsible for the majority of reports the commission issued, including virtually all the reports for scenic landmarks, this was a distinction without a difference. The staff worked with the city agency making the application until the proposal was considered appropriate. A report was then issued. If a project needed to be reviewed by the commissioners at a public hearing, staff made recommendations for approval or for revisions to make it appropriate. The commissioners regularly required changes to the design before voting. No city agency wanted to be seen as undertaking work on a designated landmark that the commission found to be inappropriate. I don't remember any discussion ever to the effect that the commission's review was only advisory, and therefore the commission would not require the applicant agency to revise the design. The middle column of the chart shows how the process worked during this time. By general agreement, landmarks reviewed projects first, issued a report, and then the applicant went to the Art Commission or PDC for its review. I attended meetings of the Art Commission to explain LPC's reasoning in approving the designs proposed for landmark projects. The Art Commission tended to defer to LPC's expertise in historic preservation. I recall no serious disagreements. Minor differences were worked out. It also must be noted that while the chart illustrates a linear process, in reality it was more iterative. The commission staff was often heavily involved in the design phase before an application was even submitted. So the process in this period shown here is as follows. The proposal came into the Landmarks Commission. We very likely were heavily involved in the design before that had even happened. It underwent the formal commission review. It may have been revised further, and LPC issued its report. Then the applying agency went to the Art Commission or PDC. It undertook its review with the benefit of the Landmarks Commission's findings and explanation, and PDC issued its certificate, which was binding on the agency. This all began to change in the Giuliani administration, with revisions to the charter and administrative code. The results of this change in the review process are seen in the right-hand column of the chart. The change was codified in section 303 of the administrative code, which is a section on the Art Commission. In one way, the change simplified the process. For most applications for work on city-owned designated landmarks, sole review authority was given to LPC. The Art Commission, now renamed the Public Design Commission or PDC, would no longer have any role in reviewing those applications. This straightforward process is shown in the right-hand column of the chart, following the arrows on the far right side. So here a proposal comes in, the Landmarks Commission reviews it, it may be revised, and if it was not a scenic landmark, the arrow followed this way, and LPC issued its binding report. But there are two exceptions, and then an exception within an exception, leading to great confusion. The change did not apply to scenic landmarks and works of art. For these two categories of work, the review process remained as it had been since 1965. Both LPC and PDC would continue to review projects in scenic landmarks. This process is shown in the right-hand column by following the arrows on the left side. A proposal comes in, Landmarks reviews it, it may be revised. For scenic landmarks and works of art, the Landmarks Commission issues an advisory report. The applying agency then goes to the Art Commission or PDC for review, and the PD issues its certificate approving or denying, which is binding. The reason that scenic landmarks were carved out is that at the time the law was changed, the reason scenic landmarks were carved out is that at the time the law was changed, the president of the Public Design Commission was Nicholas Quinnell, a landscape architect very knowledgeable about historic landscapes. He successfully retained PDC's jurisdiction over scenic landmarks. The exception to the exception concerns existing buildings in scenic landmarks. For proposed work primarily affecting existing buildings, jurisdiction is solely with the Landmarks Commission. This process is described in the right-hand column by following the middle arrows. So here a proposal comes in, the Landmarks Commission reviews it, it may be revised. If the proposal is for an existing building in a scenic landmark, the LPC issues a binding report and the application does not go to PTC. The process has led to considerable confusion. There has never been a clear definition of what it means for work to primarily concern an existing building. Many projects in scenic landmarks involve work on both a building and an adjacent landscape. There's also no adequate definition of what a building is. Many park structures are hybrids. For example, the Central Park Terrace and Grant's Tomb both have interior rooms that people can enter. Are these buildings, monuments, pavilions, something else? The Commission tends to define building very narrowly, thereby avoiding binding jurisdiction whenever it can. One would think it would take the opposite approach. And finally, a word about binding versus advisory reports. These are not terms seen anywhere in the law. LPC reports are just reports. When the law was changed to give LPC binding jurisdiction over most applications for city-owned sites, the Commission adopted the convention of calling those binding reports. For most work in scenic landmarks, the Commission adopted the term advisory report. These terms may effectively describe the jurisdiction, but emphasizing the term advisory has had the effect of minimizing the Commission's role in its review of projects in scenic landmarks. It's as if there is an unsaid word, as in the Commission's review is only advisory. In fact, for a time, the Commission stopped holding any public hearings on applications for work in scenic landmarks, believing there was no need for public input when the Commission's role was so minor. It's important to understand that this attitude and the review procedures that have been developed around it are not inherent in the law, but reflect the attitudes and interests of those currently in charge. That things can be done differently is demonstrated by the long history of the Commission's robust role in the designation, restoration, and regulation of scenic landmarks. Thank you very much. And I think now we have a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Great, thank you. If anyone has any questions, you can either put them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself.
I can unmute myself. Hey.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Question about Verde Square, since I live near there. I was surprised, I was interested in some of the things that you showed. And so is that private effort that takes care of some of these parks, is that in conjunction with the city? Or do they have to get permission of the city to do that renovation of the statue in the grounds, or how does that work?
Yes, they need to work with the Parks Department in the case of Verde Square. The Parks Department has provided some assistance like soil, just permissions for alterations to the landscape. They probably helped to put some of the gates in, but it's most of the effort has been by the Friends group on a volunteer basis, getting donations.
Thank you.
Anything else? Oh, here's. Any scenic landmarks in queue at LPC at present? From John Bacon. Not that I'm aware of. Given that they've done on average one every 4 years, I'm not expecting anything soon, but certainly there are other parks in the city that are deserving. Question about information on the scenic landmark application. Now, do you mean the application for the designation? if that's the case, I'm not sure there was one. The commission doesn't always undertake designations based on public requests. Very often, they're internally generated, and I believe that was the case for Eastern and Ocean Parkways. In any event, that material would be so old, it would be pretty hard to come by. I think that I know that the Coney Island Boardwalk was the result of outside advocacy. I imagine that the Old Aqueduct Walk was as well, although I'm not sure about that. And I suspect that every other scenic landmark has been something generated internally. At one time, the chair of the commission, Kent Barwick, and I think other commissioners were very much interested in using the scenic landmark designations.
So is there not a an RFP for scenic landmarks the way you would do for any other landmark?
Yes, and the process would be the same, and certainly it can be done. Yeah, I don't know whether the commission, whether those RFPs are on the commission's website or not. I'm not sure how to find out what may have been requested. New York, but let's see. Yes, Marshalloux Parkway would be a great next one. New York Botanical Garden is not a scenic landmark, neither is the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And interestingly enough, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden is on a site that was originally proposed to be part of Prospect Park, as is the Brooklyn Museum. But Olmsted and Vaux convinced the city of Brooklyn to leave those sites out of the park and to buy other land to the south and west, meaning that the museum and the Botanic Garden could be developed without interfering with the park design. There are landmark structures in both of those botanic gardens, but the gardens themselves are not designated. The zoos within the parks are designated. The commission spent many hours reviewing the alterations to the Prospect Park and Central Park zoos in the past.
Okay, well, as it is after 7 and I don't see any other questions, I think, sorry, Miss Lynn, are you trying to ask a question?
No,
Okay. You never remuted
sorry.
yourself. Sorry.
Sorry.
As you've all seen, this has been recorded. As I said in the beginning, all of our classes are on our YouTube channel. Please do check that out. And again, if you have any questions about upcoming events, please go to our website, hdc.org, or you can contact me. Thank you very much, Jeremy. This has been fantastic. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Always very much appreciate it.
Thank you all very much.
Have a good night, everyone.